The music did not merely stop, it fractured. Nora Bell's fingers, usually so precise and invisible, stumbled into a jarring dissonance as the weight of a sudden shadow fell across the ivory keys. She did not look up immediately, keeping her gaze anchored to the mahogany wood, but the air around her grew thin, charged with a predatory intensity that had no place in a polite ballroom. The heavy velvet drapes of her alcove offered no protection against the man now standing over her, his presence a commanding blot of dark green against the shimmering golden light of the crystal chandeliers. "That one," Duke Frederick Halloway said, his voice a low, rough velvet that cut through the polite hum of the gala like a blade. Nora's heart hammered a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. She instinctively tried to pull her left hand away, seeking to hide the tarnished silver ring beneath the folds of her modest burgundy dress, but she was far too slow. The Duke's gloved hand clamped over her wrist with a strength that was both terrifying and strangely steady. He did not just hold her, he claimed the moment, forcing her hand upward until the flickering light of 1,000 candles caught the intricate, worn crest etched into the silver heirloom. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace," the hostess stammered, fluttering at the Duke's elbow with a look of mounting social horror. "The girl is merely the help. If her playing is not to your liking, I shall have her replaced." "Be silent," Frederick commanded, never breaking his piercing gaze from Nora's wide, startled eyes. He leaned in with a sudden, localized intensity, his face inches from hers, his expression a mask of cold, sharp focus. The 10 years he had spent hunting for a ghost seemed to settle into his shoulders in that single, breathless second. "This is the Crest of Valehart. A house that was believed to be extinct, burned to ash a decade ago." Nora felt the room spinning. The elegant gowns and suits of the aristocrats blurred into a sea of hushed shock and whispered scandal. She wanted to deny it, to tell him she was a nobody, a ghost who lived on tea and the charity of strangers, but her voice died in her throat. The heat of his hand through the glove was the only reality in a world that had just turned upside down. "Look at me," the Duke whispered, the command in his tone enough to pin her to the piano bench. "You've spent enough time hiding in the shadows of other people's lives. You aren't Nora Bell. You are Elinor Valehart, and I have spent half my life searching for you." The music had died, and in the deafening silence that followed, the invisible girl was finally, irrevocably seen. The silence that followed the Duke's declaration was more deafening than the crash of the piano keys had been. It was a thick, suffocating thing, heavy with the scent of expensive lilies and the sudden, sharp ozone of a scandal. 100 pairs of eyes, once glazed with boredom or focused on the rhythm of the dance, were now pinned to the girl in the burgundy dress. Nora felt the weight of them like physical blows, a barrage of judgment and curiosity that threatened to pull the very air from her lungs. "You are mistaken, Your Grace," Nora whispered, her voice trembling so violently it was barely audible over the frantic thrumming of her own heart. She tried to tug her hand back, but Frederick's grip was an iron shackle, gloved and steady. I am Nora Bell. I have played for the Halloways, the Greys, the Middletons. I am a musician, nothing more. A musician who wears the crest of a dead house." Frederick's voice was like grinding stone, low and dangerous. He didn't look at the crowd, he didn't look at the hostess, Lady Danbury, who was currently fanning herself with such vigor she looked likely to take flight. He looked only at Nora, his dark eyes searching her face with a terrifying, clinical precision. "I knew your father, girl. I sat at his table. I saw this ring on his hand every time he raised a glass to the king. Do you take me for a fool?" "My father was a watchmaker in Eastcheap," she lied, the words tumbling out in a desperate, practiced rush. It was the story she had told herself for 10 years, the armor she had built to keep the fire from burning her again. The ring was a gift, found in the gutter, or bought at a pawn shop. "I don't know." "Please, you're hurting me." The lie was a thin veil, and they both knew it. Frederick's gaze flickered to her hand, pale, slender, and despite the callus from hours of practice, possessed of an inherent, skeletal grace that no common watchmaker's daughter could claim. He loosened his grip slightly, but he did not release her. Instead, he leaned closer, his dark green coat smelling of cedar and rain, a stark contrast to the cloying perfumes of the ballroom. Watchmakers do not have the Valehart jaw, nor do they possess eyes the color of a winter sea, he murmured, his voice dropping to a private, devastating register. And they certainly do not flinch at the mention of a fire they claim never happened. Around them, the hushed shock, mentioned by the gossips, began to melt into a low, predatory murmur. The aristocrats moved closer, their elegant gowns and stiff cravats creating a colorful, suffocating wall. They were no longer guests, they were a jury. Nora saw the sneer of a young debutante in the front row, the confused squint of an elderly earl, and the calculating, cold stare of the dowager duchess. "Is this true, Halloway?" a man's voice called out from the throng, a sharp, nasal tone that made Nora's blood run cold. She didn't have to look to know the face of a skeptic. The Valehart girl died in the north wing. There wasn't enough left of her to bury. The north wing fell, Frederick replied, his voice booming now, reclaiming the room's attention with effortless authority. He stood tall, pulling Nora up with him so she was forced to stand on trembling legs, her modest dress looking like a bloodstain against the polished mahogany of the piano. But the body they found was that of a servant girl in the heiress's nightgown. I suspected it then, and I see the truth now. The house of Valehart did not end in ash. It has been playing for its supper in our drawing rooms. The room erupted. The scandal was no longer a spark, it was a conflagration. Nora felt the world tilting. The faces of the ton became a blur of white and gold. The panic that had been a low hum in the back of her mind for a decade suddenly surged forward, a tidal wave of ice-cold terror. They would know. Her uncle would know. The man who had held the torch while she hid in the coal cellar would hear of this, and he would come to finish what he started. "No," she gasped, her eyes darting toward the heavy velvet drapes of the service exit. "No, you're wrong. I'm nobody. I'm nobody." With a strength born of pure, animal desperation, she wrenched her arm free. The sudden movement caught Frederick off guard, his fingers slipping from her wrist just long enough for her to bolt. She didn't care about the piano, her sheet music, or the meager fee she was owed for the night. She ran, her burgundy skirts snapping like a flag as she wove through the startled silk-clad bodies of the elite. "Elinor," the Duke's voice roared behind her, a command that echoed off the high, gilded ceiling. She didn't stop. She burst through the service doors, the cool air of the hallway hitting her face like a benediction. But as she fled toward the darkness of the London streets, she could still feel the phantom pressure of his hand on her wrist, and the terrifying weight of a name she had spent 10 years trying to forget. The discordant note had been struck, and the music of her life would never be the same again. The rain was a cold, biting reality that stripped away the lingering warmth of the ballroom. Nora ran until her lungs burned and her thin, mended slippers were soaked through by the treacherous London puddles. The shadows of the alleyways were her only friends, or so she had believed for a decade. But the shadows were no longer empty. The rhythmic clatter of a high-speed carriage and the heavy, deliberate footfalls of a man who refused to be outpaced echoed against the cobblestones. She didn't make it to the main thoroughfare. A gloved hand caught her shoulder, not with the violence of a captor, but with the immovable weight of a mountain. Nora spun, her breath hitching in a sob of pure terror, only to find herself staring into the dark green coat and the piercing, relentless eyes of Duke Frederick Halloway. "The carriage is waiting, Elinor," he said, his voice remarkably steady despite the downpour. "You can freeze in this gutter, or you can come with me and learn why you are still alive." "I am Nora," she hissed, though her teeth were chattering so loudly the name felt fractured. "Nora Bell. Please, Your Grace. I just want to go home. Home. Frederick's expression darkened, a flash of something akin to grief crossing his features. You have no home. Not until we take it back. Your home is a den of thieves led by a man who thinks you are a handful of bone and ash. He didn't wait for her consent. He ushered her into the velvet-lined interior of his carriage, throwing a heavy wool cloak over her shivering shoulders. The ride to his private residence was a blur of silence and the smell of wet wool. Nora huddled in the corner, her fingers clutching the silver ring so tightly the metal bit into her skin. She felt like a trapped bird, waiting for the killing blow. When they arrived at Halloway House, he did not lead her to a drawing room or a guest suite. He led her deep into the bowels of his private library, a room that smelled of old parchment, cedarwood, and the faint, sharp scent of gun oil. He locked the door behind them, a sound that made Nora jump, and gestured toward a chair by the roaring fireplace. Sit, he commanded. He went to a heavy oak desk and retrieved a small, velvet-lined box. Nora sat, the heat of the fire beginning to thaw her frozen limbs, though her mind remained locked in ice. Why are you doing this? She whispered. Why would a duke care about a piano player? Frederick didn't answer immediately. He opened the box and pulled out a piece of parchment, yellowed with age and stained at the edges. He laid it on the table between them. It was a letter, the handwriting elegant but hurried. At the bottom was the seal of the House of Valehart. Your father, Julian Valehart, was not merely my mentor, Frederick began, his voice dropping to a low, somber resonance. He was the man who raised me after my own father died in the wars. He taught me how to lead, how to hunt, and how to tell the difference between a man's word and a snake's hiss. I was his protégé. I was to be his sword. Nora stared at the letter, her eyes tracing the familiar slant of the script. A memory, long buried under layers of trauma, flickered, a tall man with a laugh like bells, teaching her how to find the middle C on a different piano, in a different life. 10 years ago, Frederick continued, standing by the mantelpiece, his silhouette tall and imposing against the flames, Julian sent me a messenger. He knew Silas was moving against him. He knew that accidental fires in the neighboring estates weren't accidents at all. He asked me to come for you. To take you to the coast. He turned to look at her, and for the first time, Nora saw the cracks in the Duke's armor. There was a raw, bleeding guilt in his gaze that no amount of noble breeding could hide. I was delayed. An overturned carriage, a flooded road, excuses that have haunted my sleep for 3,000 nights. When I reached the Valehart estate, the north wing was a skeleton of fire. I fought my way into the wreckage. I found Julian in the study. He was dying. Nora pressed her hands to her ears, but his voice followed her into the dark. He didn't ask for water. He didn't ask for a priest, Frederick said, his voice cracking. He grabbed my lapel with the last of his strength and made me swear a blood oath. He told me you were gone, that you had run into the woods. He made me vow on the honor of my name and the soul of my house that I would not rest, I would not marry, and I would not draw a peaceful breath until I found his daughter and restored her to her seat. He reached into his vest and pulled out a small dagger, its hilt encrusted with emeralds. He didn't wield it as a weapon, but as a relic. I spent a decade following ghosts, Elinor. I checked every orphanage, every workhouse, every traveling troupe in the kingdom. I had almost given up hope that you had survived the winter of that year. And then, I walked into a ballroom and heard a melody, a specific, haunting arrangement of The Winter Rose. It was the song your mother wrote. And there you were. Playing it for people who aren't fit to shine your shoes. Nora looked up, her face wet with more than just rain. The wall she had built around her heart, the wall of Nora Bell, the nobody, was crumbling. Silas, you'll kill me if he knows. Frederick stepped forward, sinking to one knee before her chair. He didn't take her hand this time, he simply lowered his head in a gesture of absolute fealty. "Let him try," the Duke whispered. "I failed your father once. I will burn this city to the ground before I let a single hair on your head be harmed. You are no longer the piano player, Elinor. You are my charge, my queen, and my path to redemption. We start tomorrow." The fire crackled, and for the first time in 10 years, the shadows in the room didn't feel like a threat. They felt like a shield. The transition from the drafty attic of a boarding house to the stifling opulence of the Rose Suite at Halloway House felt less like a rescue and more like a different kind of captivity. Nora woke at 4 in the morning, her internal clock still tuned to the rhythms of the servants' world. She sat bolt upright in a bed of goosedown and silk, her heart racing as she waited for the shrill call of the housekeeper or the urgent need to stoke the kitchen fires. Instead, there was only a silence so profound it felt heavy. The room was bathed in the pale, pre-dawn light of London, catching the delicate floral carvings of the wainscoting and the silver brushes on the vanity. For a moment, she stared at her hands, reddened, calloused, and shaking. She was a ghost haunting a palace, a piece of street grit trapped in a velvet jewelry box. When a soft knock sounded at the door 2 hours later, Nora was already standing by the window, fully dressed in her old burgundy gown, her bed meticulously made. The young maid who entered, a girl no older than 18 named Betsy, stopped dead in the doorway, a tray of chocolate nearly slipping from her fingers. "Oh, miss. You shouldn't have," Betsy squeaked, her eyes darting to the perfectly smooth sheets. "It's my place to do the linens. And you've dressed yourself." "I didn't want to be a bother," Nora said, her voice small. She instinctively moved to take the tray from the girl, but Betsy recoiled as if she'd been burned. "Please, Miss Elinor. If the Duke sees me letting a lady carry her own breakfast, I'll be back in the scullery by noon." The name Elinor hit Nora with the force of a physical blow. She retreated to a stiff-backed chair, watching with a mixture of guilt and fascination as the maid bustled about, opening heavy velvet curtains and laying out a selection of morning gowns that cost more than Nora had earned in a decade of playing. This was the first lesson in her new life. A lady's power was defined by what she allowed others to do for her. It was a lesson that felt dangerously like helplessness. An hour later, she was summoned to the Duke's private breakfast room. Frederick was already there, illuminated by the morning sun that poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He looked less like the vengeful shadow of the rainy streets and more like the sovereign of his domain, dressed in a crisp white shirt and an impeccably tailored waistcoat. He didn't look up from his papers until she reached the table, but when he did, his gaze narrowed. "The burgundy dress again," he remarked, though his tone wasn't unkind. "I believe there were at least 4 silk day dresses delivered to your chambers this morning." "They felt fragile," Nora replied, sinking into the chair a footman held out for her. She felt like a fraud sitting at the head of a table laden with silver tureens and bone china. "I was afraid I would tear them." "You are a Valehart," Frederick said, setting his quill down with a deliberate click. "You were born to wear silk. The burgundy is a shroud, Elinor. It belongs to the girl who had to hide. We are through with hiding." He watched her as she picked up a silver fork, her movements stiff and overly cautious. When she reached for the teapot, her sleeve caught on a crystal marmalade jar, sending it wobbling toward the edge of the table. Nora gasped, her hand darting out with the lightning speed of a woman used to catching falling sheet music. She caught it an inch from the floor, but the exertion left her face flushed with shame. "I'm sorry," she whispered, carefully replacing the jar. "I'm not. I don't fit here." "You fit wherever you choose to stand," Frederick said, his voice dropping to that low, resonant register that made her pulse quicken. "But your instincts are currently those of a survivor, not a ruler. You move as if you are trying not to displace the air around you." You look for permission in the eyes of the servants. This must change. How? She asked, the spark of her old defiance flickering. I have spent 10 years learning how to be invisible. You cannot expect me to become a sun in a single morning. I expect you to learn that authority is a form of armor, he countered. He rose from his seat and walked around the table, stopping just behind her. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat radiating from him. Today, we begin the restoration. Not just of your name, but of your spirit. You will learn to walk as if the floor beneath you was built solely for your footsteps. You will learn to speak as if the silence was waiting for your voice. The morning was spent in a grueling series of observations. Frederick did not hire a governess, he took the task upon himself, perhaps because he trusted no one else with the secret of her unrefined edges. He watched her walk across the library, correcting the tilt of her chin. He listened to her speak, pruning the common London vowels from her speech until her voice sounded like the bells she remembered from her childhood. The hardest part was the hands. Frederick sat her down at a table and placed a heavy, ancient book in front of her. Turn the pages, he commanded. Nora reached out, but her fingers hovered. I'll stain it. My hands, they aren't clean. They are the hands of a pianist, Frederick said, reaching out to finally cover her hand with his. His skin was warm, his touch firm. The calluses are proof of your discipline. The scars are proof of your strength. They are not dirty, Elinor. They are the hands of a woman who refused to die. Now, use them. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, amber shadows across the library, Nora felt a shift. She was exhausted, her back aching from the forced posture, her mind reeling from the constant vigilance. But when she looked in the mirror positioned by the door, she didn't see Nora the piano player. The girl in the glass had a spine made of steel and eyes that had begun to reclaim their lost fire. You look tired, Frederick noted, standing by the fireplace. I am, she admitted. It is harder work to be a lady than it ever was to play for 8 hours straight. Because you are fighting yourself, he said. He walked over to a draped object in the corner of the room, the tall, rectangular shape she hadn't noticed before. With a sharp tug, he pulled the cloth away. Nora gasped. It was a portrait. A woman with auburn hair and eyes the color of a winter sea stared back at her, draped in Valehart blue, a gentle, knowing smile on her lips. My mother, Nora whispered, her servant heart finally breaking under the weight of the heiress's grief. She was the most formidable woman I ever knew, Frederick said softly. She didn't lead with a shout, she led with a presence that made everyone else want to be better. That is your blood, Elinor. That is your heritage. Do not be afraid to claim it. Nora reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the gilded frame. For the first time, the lessons didn't feel like a performance. They felt like a homecoming. She turned back to the Duke, her chin rising an inch higher without him having to tell her. What is next? She asked. Frederick's lips curved into the ghost of a smile, a rare, dangerous expression that transformed his face. Next, we prepare for your uncle. He has heard the rumors of the ghost of Halloway house. He will come to see if the fire left anything behind. And when he does, you will be ready to burn him. The news of the ghost of Halloway house did not travel by messenger, it moved like a slow-acting poison through the tea rooms and gentlemen's clubs of Mayfair. It began as a titter behind lace fans and evolved into a coordinated campaign of character assassination. Lord Silas Valehart, a man whose soul was as cold as the stone floors of the estate he had usurped, did not need to see his niece to know she was a threat. He merely needed to ensure that by the time she stepped into the light, the world saw not an heiress, but a common fraud. Lord Silas sat in the study that had once belonged to his brother, Julian. He sipped a glass of aged brandy, his eyes fixed on the ledger that detailed the Valehart debts he had accrued through years of excess. The rumors had reached him via a frantic Lady Danbury, who was still recovering from the musical assault at her gala. A common piano player, Halloway had claimed. A girl with the Valehart ring. Silas's fingers tightened around his glass. He had watched the north wind burn. He had heard the screams. But he had never found the body of the girl, and that omission had been a splinter in his mind for a decade. He didn't believe in ghosts, but he did believe in the Duke of Halloway's stubbornness. If Frederick was championing this girl, Silas couldn't simply kill her, not yet. He would have to destroy the very idea of her first. By the end of the week, the morning broadsheets were humming with anonymous tips. They spoke of a theatrical girl, plucked from the gutters of East London, a failed actress whom the Duke was attempting to pass off as nobility to settle an old score. The whispers were precise and lethal. They suggested the silver ring was a clever forgery and that the girl's piano skills were the only authentic thing about her, a trade learned in the brothels of the docks. Inside Halloway House, the air grew thick with the pressure of the unseen enemy. Nora, now Elinor in name, if not yet in spirit, found the Duke in the library, staring at a folded copy of the Morning Post. His face was a mask of controlled fury, the veins in his neck tight against his starched collar. "He is moving faster than I anticipated," Frederick said, his voice a low vibration of anger. He didn't offer her the paper. He didn't want her to see the filth they were writing about her. "Is it Silas?" Elinor asked, her voice steadier than it would have been 3 days ago. She stood by the window, the sunlight catching the new silk of her morning gown, a soft, dusty blue that made her look like a piece of the sky. "He is a coward who fights with ink because he is afraid of steel," Frederick replied. He walked toward her, the heavy thud of his boots the only sound in the cavernous room. "He is telling the ton that you are a parlor trick. He is planting seeds of doubt so that when you finally claim your title, the House of Lords will view you as a criminal rather than a victim." Elinor felt a cold shiver of the old Nora, the girl who wanted to run, to hide, to melt back into the shadows of the piano alcove. "Perhaps he is right to doubt," she whispered, looking down at her hands. "I still feel like a player in a costume. Every time a footman bows, I expect him to laugh." Frederick stopped inches from her. He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek before he drew it back, exercising a restraint that seemed to cost him dearly. "The only person who can make you a fraud is you, Elinor. Silas is not attacking your blood, he is attacking your resolve. He wants you to stay Nora Bell. He wants you to believe you are the dirt on his boot so that you won't have the courage to kick him out of your father's house." The social sabotage intensified. Invitations that had been tentatively extended to the Duke were quietly rescinded if it was hinted he might bring his ward. Merchants who had served the Valeharts for generations were suddenly unable to fulfill orders for the Duke's household. The message was clear. London was closing its doors to the pretender. The climax of the week came in the form of a single, cream-colored envelope delivered on a silver tray. It bore the seal of the Crown, an invitation to the midsummer masquerade at the Royal Conservatory. "This is it," Frederick said, looking at the card. "Silas has used his influence to ensure the king is present. He wants to force a public confrontation. He believes that under the pressure of the royal gaze, you will stumble. He thinks your servant's tongue will betray you." "Then why go?" Elinor asked, her heart hammering. "If it's a trap, why walk into it?" "Because a Valehart does not skulk in the shadows while a thief wears their crown," Frederick said, his eyes flashing with a protective, almost feral intensity. He stepped closer, his presence eclipsing everything else in the room. "We will go. You will wear the Valehart blue. You will wear the ring. And you will play the piano, Elinor. Not as a hired servant, but as the mistress of the house. You will show them that the fire didn't just leave ash, it tempered the steel. He took her hand, his thumb brushing over the silver ring. The contact was electric, a silent vow of protection that went far beyond the blood oath he had made to her father. In that moment, the rumors and the whispers felt small. The shadow of your uncle is long, Frederick whispered, but it cannot survive the light. We have 2 weeks to turn your fear into a weapon. Are you ready? Elinor looked at the portrait of her mother on the wall, then back into the Duke's piercing gaze. The piano player was gone. The heiress was still finding her voice. But the woman standing between them was finally ready to fight. Tell the dressmaker I want the Valehart blue, she said, her voice clear and resonant. And tell the Duke I shall need no more lessons in walking. I know exactly where I am going. The Royal Conservatory was a glass-domed cathedral of light and greenery, its air thick with the scent of forced orange blossoms and the metallic tang of 1,000 beeswax candles. Beneath the soaring iron rafters, London's elite moved like schools of tropical fish, their faces hidden behind masks of porcelain, lace, and gold. It was a sea of anonymity that should have felt like a sanctuary for a woman who had spent 10 years in the shadows, but as the Halloway carriage slowed to a halt, Elinor felt as if she were being delivered to a scaffold. Breathe, Elinor, Frederick said. His voice was the only steady thing in a world that had begun to tilt. He sat opposite her, a shadow in the dim carriage light, his own mask of dark emerald velvet resting on the seat beside him. The masks are for them. You have no need for one. Tonight, you are the only person in this room who is truly seen. He reached out, his gloved hand covering hers where it rested on her lap. The sapphire silk of her gown, the true Valehart blue, shimmered like deep water against the stark white of his glove. She looked down at the silver ring, now polished until it glowed with a fierce, defiant light. They will be looking for a piano player in a costume, she whispered, her voice catching. They will be looking for the stutter, the slumped shoulders, the fear. Then do not give it to them, Frederick commanded, his eyes catching the light of the torches outside. You are not playing a part. You are reclaiming a throne. When the carriage door opened, the roar of the crowd felt like a physical blow. Frederick stepped out first, offering his hand with a grace that was both protective and possessive. As Elinor stepped onto the red carpet, the whispers began. They were like the dry rustle of dead leaves, skittering across the marble steps. Is that her? The gutter girl? The Duke's little foundling? They entered the ballroom not as guests, but as a challenge. The music, a light, frivolous quadrille, seemed to falter as they crossed the threshold. At the far end of the hall, seated beneath a canopy of gold leaf and crimson velvet, sat the king. Beside him stood Lord Silas Valehart, his face unmasked and etched with a sneer of such cold confidence that Elinor felt the old Nora Bell screaming to turn and run. The king raised a hand, and the music died. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic thump of Frederick's walking stick against the polished floor as they approached the dais. Halloway, the king greeted, his voice weathered but sharp. You bring a ghost to our midsummer revels. Rumor has it the House of Valehart has risen from the charcoal. The House of Valehart never fell, Your Majesty, Frederick replied, bowing with a crisp, military precision that signaled he was prepared for a fight. It was merely waiting for the right moment to step back into the light. May I present the Lady Elinor, daughter of Julian, heiress of the Valehart estates. Silas stepped forward, his eyes raking over Elinor with a lethal, predatory hunger. A bold claim, Frederick. But we all know that anyone can be bought a silk dress and taught to mimic a noble accent. The girl has the ring, yes, a ring that went missing the night my brother died. A thief might wear a ring. A servant might find it in the ruins. Enough, the king barked. He looked at Elinor, his gaze heavy with the wisdom of a man who had seen 1,000 pretenders. Julian Valehart was a friend to this crown. He was also a man of secrets. He once told me that a true Valehart carries the history of their house not in their pockets, but in their blood. He left a gift in the royal archives, a music box that can only be opened by a specific sequence of notes known only to his lineage. If this girl is who you say she is, she will open it. A footman stepped forward, carrying a small, intricate box made of dark rosewood and silver. It was a silent instrument, with no keys, only a series of silver pins that responded to the vibrations of the human voice or a specific touch. Elinor felt her heart stop. This was the test Silas had prepared for. He stood back, a thin, triumphant smile touching his lips. He knew the sequence was lost. He had searched for it for 10 years. Elinor looked at the box, then at the Duke. Frederick's face was a mask of stone, but his eyes were burning with a desperate, silent plea, remember. She closed her eyes, blocking out the glittering gowns, the judgmental masks, and the uncle who wanted her dead. She went back to the nursery, to the smell of lavender and the sound of her mother's voice. She remembered the piano, not the grand mahogany beast of Halloway House, but the small, upright spinet in the north wing. Her mother had taught her a game, the lullaby of the keys. She reached out, her fingers hovering over the silver pins. She didn't press them, she stroked them, her touch as light as a breeze over water. She hummed a low, haunting melody, the middle refrain of the winter rose, and let her fingers follow the vibration of the song. Click. The lid of the box didn't just open, it bloomed. A delicate, crystalline melody began to play, a song that hadn't been heard in London for a decade. The king's expression softened, his eyes widening in recognition. The Valehart lullaby, the king whispered. He stood, his gaze fixing on Elinor with a new, profound respect. Only Julian's daughter could have known the resonance of that lock. Lord Silas, it seems your niece has a more reliable memory than you gave her credit for. Silas's face turned a mottled, violent purple, but before he could speak, the king gestured to the orchestra. The first waltz belongs to the House of Valehart. Let the music begin. The orchestra struck up a sweeping, romantic waltz, the strings soaring toward the glass dome. Frederick turned to Elinor, his hand extending in a silent invitation. As they moved onto the floor, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. For the first time, Elinor didn't look at the floor. She looked at Frederick. As his hand settled on her waist and she placed hers on his shoulder, the world narrowed until there was only the rhythm of the music and the heat of his presence. You did it, he murmured, his voice thick with a sudden, raw emotion. He spun her into the center of the room, his dark green coat a blur of color. We did it, she corrected. The dance was a transformation. With every turn, the piano player shed another layer of her invisibility. She moved with a liquid grace that silenced the skeptics and burned the rumors to ash. She felt the weight of the Valehart blue, not as a costume, but as a skin. But as the dance reached its crescendo, she caught sight of Silas standing in the shadows of a marble pillar. He wasn't looking at the king, and he wasn't looking at the box. He was looking at Elinor with a cold, terrifying promise. He had lost the first battle, but the war had only just begun. He won't stop, Elinor whispered as Frederick pulled her closer, his breath warm against her temple. Neither will I, the Duke replied, his grip tightening. The king has seen you. Now, we make sure the rest of the world never forgets you. As the waltz ended, Elinor stood in the center of the ballroom, the silver ring shining under the chandeliers. She was no longer a ghost. She was Elinor Valehart, and for the first time in 10 years, she wasn't afraid of the light. The carriage journey from the gilded cages of London to the hollowed-out carcass of the Valehart estate was a descent into a cold, grey purgatory. As the Halloway crest moved past the rusted iron gates, the lush greenery of the English countryside seemed to wither, replaced by choking ivy and trees that reached toward the sky like skeletal, charred fingers. Elinor sat in the shadows of the velvet interior, her fingers tracing the silver ring with a frantic, rhythmic intensity. The Valehart blue of her gown felt heavy now, less like a banner of victory and more like a shroud. "You don't have to do this today," Frederick said, his voice breaking the suffocating silence of the cabin. He watched her with a vigilance that bordered on the painful, his hand resting near his walking stick. "The king's recognition is enough to hold Silas at bay for a time. We can wait until the spring." "No," Elinor whispered, her gaze fixed on the approaching ruin. "If I am to take this house back, I must first walk through the fire that took it from me. I cannot be a duchess if I am still a girl hiding in a coal cellar." When the carriage finally slowed to a halt, the silence that greeted them was absolute. The great house, once a masterpiece of limestone and light, was now a jagged wound against the horizon. The north wing, where Elinor's nursery had been, was a collapsed heap of blackened stone and rotted timber. The air here still smelled of damp ash and ancient grief, a scent that bypassed her reason and struck directly at the primal centers of her brain. Frederick stepped out and offered his hand. As Elinor's feet touched the cracked marble of the front steps, the first fragment of memory splintered through her mind. The sound of laughter. Not her own, but her father's, booming through the foyer as he swung her in a circle, her small silk shoes clicking against this very stone. She took a step forward, her breath hitching. Frederick stayed half a pace behind her, a silent, emerald-clad sentinel. He didn't lead, he followed, allowing her to navigate the geography of her own trauma. They moved through the skeletal remains of the Great Hall, where the roof had long ago surrendered to the elements, leaving the floor littered with the debris of a lost life. Elinor moved toward the ruins of the library. It was here that the heat of the memory began to rise. She saw the charred remains of the mahogany shelves, the very ones Frederick had described, and the ghost of a piano sat in the corner, its ivory keys long ago melted into a grotesque, blackened smile. "This is where he was," she murmured, her voice hollow. "My father. He was sitting at the desk. He was writing a letter." She closed her eyes, and the world shifted. The smell of damp ivy vanished, replaced by the suffocating, oily stench of smoke. The silence was drowned out by the roar of the conflagration and the frantic, rhythmic thud-thud-thud of a heavy boot. "Run, Elinor! Do not look back!" The memory surged forward with the violence of a flood. She was small again, her nightgown catching on the splinters of the floorboards. The heat was a living thing, a red beast clawing at her lungs. She had reached the hidden door behind the tapestry, the one that led to the service tunnels, but she had stopped. She had turned back because she had heard a voice. A voice that wasn't her father's. "I remember the heat," she gasped, her body swaying. Frederick moved to catch her, his arms a solid, grounding weight against her back. But there was someone else. Someone Julian was arguing with. "Silas?" Frederick asked, his jaw tight. "No," she whispered, her brow furrowing as she fought to sharpen the blurred edges of the past. "Silas was outside. I saw him through the window later, watching the flames. But in the room, there was another. Someone who held the torch." She pulled away from Frederick, drawn by a magnetic pull toward the blackened remains of the hearth. She knelt in the soot, her expensive silk skirts soaking up the grime of a decade. Her hand brushed against a heavy, iron fire poker that lay twisted among the stones. The door had burst open. A man had stepped into the study, his face illuminated by the flickering orange light of the encroaching fire. He wasn't a servant, and he wasn't a lord. He wore a heavy, dark coat and a tricorn hat pulled low, but as he leaned over her father's desk to tip the oil lamp, the light had caught his profile. Elinor's eyes snapped open, and she looked up at Frederick, her face as white as the ash around them. "It wasn't just an accident, and it wasn't just Silas's greed," she said, her voice trembling with a new, terrifying clarity. I remember the face of the man with the torch. I saw him again tonight, Frederick. At the masquerade. The Duke's expression went deathly still. At the Royal Conservatory? Who, Elinor? He was standing directly behind the king, she whispered, the horror of the realization settling into her bones. The man in the black mask with the silver embroidery. The one Silas whispered to before the music box was brought out. It was Sir Alistair, the king's own magistrate. The revelation hung in the stagnant air of the ruins like a death sentence. The conspiracy was larger than a greedy uncle, it reached into the very heart of the crown's law. Silas hadn't just stolen her home, he had bought the men responsible for protecting it. Elinor stood up, the soot-stained silk of her Valehart blue gown fluttering in the cold wind that whistled through the empty window frames. She looked at the wreckage of her childhood, at the grave of her parents, and the fear that had defined her for 10 years finally, irrevocably, burned away. It was replaced by a cold, sharp-edged fury that felt as old as the stone beneath her feet. They didn't just want the estate, she said, her voice dropping to a low, lethal register. They wanted the Valehart name silenced because my father knew who the traitors were. Frederick stepped toward her, his eyes reflecting the steel in her own. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb brushing over the silver ring. Then we are no longer just fighting for a title, Elinor. We are fighting for the throne itself. Elinor looked one last time at the north wing, then turned her back on the ruins. She began to walk toward the carriage, her steps no longer the hesitant strides of a piano player, but the measured, purposeful gait of a woman going to war. Let them come, she said, the wind catching her auburn hair. The fire didn't finish me then, and it won't finish me now. It's time we showed Sir Alistair and my uncle what happens when you leave a Valehart in the embers. The journey back to London was a descent into a different kind of darkness. The physical soot of the Valehart ruins clung to Elinor's sapphire silk, but it was the shadow of Sir Alistair's face that sat heavy in the carriage between them. For hours, neither spoke. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels was the only sound against the relentless drumming of rain, creating a hollow, echoing space where the business of their arrangement felt suddenly, sharply insufficient. When they arrived at Halloway House, the grand foyer felt too bright, too clinical. Elinor walked past the bowing footman as if she were a ghost returning to a masquerade. She didn't head for the Rose Suite. Instead, she found herself drawn to the library, the one room that smelled of the same cedar and leather as the Duke himself. She didn't turn on the lamps. She simply sat on the floor by the cold hearth, her head resting against the side of the mahogany grand piano, her fingers tracing the silver ring in the dark. A moment later, the door creaked. The heavy, measured tread of Frederick's boots vibrated through the floorboards. He didn't ask for permission to enter, he simply walked to the hearth and began to stir the embers, the firelight catching the sharp, worried line of his jaw. You should be resting, he said, his voice a low resonance that seemed to vibrate in her chest. The physician can be summoned if the memories are too much. Elinor finished for him, her voice sounding thin and metallic. She looked up at him, her face smudged with ash, her auburn hair falling in tangled waves over her shoulders. I am not fragile, Frederick. I survived 10 years of hunger and invisibility. A few ghosts won't break me. Frederick dropped the iron poker. He turned to her, his dark green coat cast in a bronze glow by the rising flames. He didn't look like a duke in that moment, he looked like a man standing on the edge of a precipice. I shouldn't have taken you there. I should have kept you here, safe behind these walls, until I had Alistair in a cell. And then what? Elinor asked, standing up slowly, her silk dress rustling like dry leaves. She walked toward him until she was only a breath away. I would still be the project. The missing piece of your blood oath. A ledger to be balanced for my father's sake. Frederick's gaze darkened, his eyes searching hers with a sudden, localized intensity. Is that what you think you are to me? A debt to be paid. It's what our contract says, isn't it? She whispered. I provide the name and the lineage. You provide the protection and the restoration. We are two soldiers in a war of convenience. The air in the library grew thick, charged with the same electric tension that had preceded the fire 10 years ago. Frederick reached out, his hand hovering near her face before he finally closed the distance. His thumb brushed a smudge of ash from her cheek, his touch surprisingly gentle for a man built of iron and duty. The oath was the reason I looked for you, he admitted, his voice dropping to a rough, intimate velvet. But the oath is not the reason I cannot sleep. It is not the reason I find myself standing outside your door at 3 in the morning, listening for the sound of your breathing to ensure the world hasn't stolen you again. Elinor's breath hitched. She looked at his hand, the hand that had clamped over hers at the piano, the hand that had guided her through the waltz. It was no longer a shackle. It was a tether. When I saw you at that piano, Frederick continued, his gaze dropping to her lips before returning to her eyes, I thought I had found my redemption. But I didn't find a ghost, Elinor. I found a woman who plays the piano with the soul of a poet and the spine of a queen. I found someone who looks at the ruins of her life and asks for a weapon instead of a handkerchief. He moved closer, his presence eclipsing the warmth of the fire. This is no longer about your father. It is no longer about the Valehart estates. If you walked away tomorrow and gave it all to Silas, I would still hunt the men who hurt you. Not because I swore to, but because the thought of you in pain is a fire I cannot put out. Elinor felt the last of Nora Bell's defenses, the armor of the invisible girl, crumble away. She reached up, her fingers grazing the fine wool of his waistcoat before settling over his heart. It was beating with a frantic, uneven rhythm that mirrored her own. I spent 10 years making sure no one ever saw me, she whispered. I thought if I stayed hidden, I would be safe. But being seen by you, it's the most terrifying thing I've ever felt. Because if you see me, then I have something left to lose. You have me, Frederick promised. He didn't wait for her to bridge the gap. He leaned in, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was both a sanctuary and a surrender. It wasn't the polite, distant affection of a business arrangement, it was a desperate, protective claim. In that moment, the library, the conspiracy, and the looming threat of Sir Alistair vanished. There was only the heat of him, the scent of cedar, and the realization that her name wasn't the only thing being restored. When they finally pulled apart, the world seemed to have shifted on its axis. Frederick kept his forehead pressed against hers, his hands resting on her waist as if he were afraid she might dissolve into smoke. The contract is broken, he murmured against her skin. Then what is this? Elinor asked, her voice finally finding its true, resonant strength. Frederick looked at her, his eyes reflecting the silver ring on her finger and the fire in her soul. This is the truth. And tomorrow, we use it to burn Silas to the ground. Elinor smiled, a real, dangerous smile that had nothing to do with being a lady. She stepped back, her hand lingering in his, and looked toward the grand piano. The missing heiress was gone. The piano player was a memory. The woman who remained was finally, irrevocably, home. The gold-leafed banqueting hall of St. James's Palace was a shimmering trap. Above, the vast ceiling boasted frescoes of ancient triumphs, but below, the atmosphere was thick with the suffocating scent of lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of hidden agendas. Elinor sat at the long, linen-draped table, the Valehart blue of her gown a defiant splash of color against the monochromatic sea of black-coated statesmen and ivory-clad debutantes. To her left, Frederick sat like a statue carved from emerald marble, his presence a silent promise of war. To her right, however, sat the very man who had tried to erase her from existence, Lord Silas. The dinner was a calculated performance. Silas was a master of the mask, leaning in to offer Elinor polite inquiries about her miraculous recovery, with a smile that never reached his pale, reptilian eyes. Across the table, Sir Alistair, the king's magistrate, watched her with the steady, unblinking focus of a hawk circling its prey. Every clink of a silver fork and every choreographed movement of the liveried footman felt like a count toward an inevitable explosion. Elinor felt the old Nora Bell stirring within her, the girl who survived by watching the things others ignored. She didn't look at the glittering jewels or the king's bored expression. Instead, she watched the hands of the servants. She noticed the slight tremor in the wrist of the man pouring the wine, and the way a specific footman lingered just a second too long behind Silas's chair. As the third course, a delicate poached turbot, was cleared, a footman approached with a special vintage, allegedly a gift from the king's private cellar to celebrate the return of the Valehart line. The man's movements were fluid, but his eyes were fixed on Elinor's crystal goblet with a terrifying intensity. He poured a deep, honey-colored liquid that caught the candlelight, but as the glass was set before her, the faint, cloying scent of bitter almonds cut through the heavy perfume of the lilies. "A toast," Silas declared, his voice cutting through the dinner chatter like a blade. He stood, raising his own glass, his eyes locked on Elinor's. "To my dear niece. May her return be as long and prosperous as the house of Valehart itself." Frederick's hand tightened on the arm of his chair. He had smelled it too. He began to rise, his jaws set in a line of lethal intent, but Elinor's hand shot out, her fingers grazing his sleeve in a silent command, "Wait." If Frederick knocked the glass away, it would be a scandal, a duke accusing the crown servants of regicide in the middle of a state dinner. Silas would claim madness, and the magistrate would have the excuse he needed to have them both removed. Elinor had to handle this as Nora Bell would, with a player's precision and a servant's invisibility. She looked at Silas, her expression one of innocent gratitude. "You are too kind, uncle. But in the house of Valehart, we have a tradition for such momentous occasions. My father always said that the first sip of a celebratory vintage should be shared with the one who provided it, as a sign of absolute trust." The table went silent. The king leaned forward, his interest piqued by the sudden shift in tone. Silas's smile faltered, the color draining from his thin lips. "A charming sentiment," Silas managed, his voice tightening. "But this was a gift from the king to you, my dear. And as a Valehart, I choose to honor the man who has held my estate in trust for so long," Elinor replied, her voice ringing with a newfound authority that made Sir Alistair shift in his seat. She didn't pick up her glass. Instead, she slid it toward Silas, the crystal base whispering against the white linen. "Please, uncle. For my father's memory. Drink with me." The trap had flipped. If Silas refused, he admitted the wine was tainted in front of the king. If he drank, he was a dead man. Elinor watched him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her fingers as steady as if she were waiting for the first beat of a concerto. She saw the sweat break on his brow, the way his gaze darted toward Sir Alistair, seeking a reprieve that wasn't coming. I find I have a sudden chill," Silas stammered, clutching his linen napkin. "I fear the excitement has overtaxed my constitution." "How unfortunate," Frederick remarked, his voice a low, predatory growl. He reached out and took the glass Elinor had slid toward Silas. He held it up to the light, sniffing the rim with a theatrical slowness. "It would be a tragedy to let such a fine gift go to waste. Perhaps we should have the royal apothecary analyze the vintage. It seems a shame for the king's cellar to be associated with such a chilling effect on the guests." Sir Alistair stood abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor. "There is no need for such theatrics, Halloway. The wine is likely just corked." "Is it?" Elinor asked, standing to face the magistrate. She didn't look like a girl from the gutters. She looked like the ghost of the North Wing, returned to settle a debt. Then perhaps the footman who poured it wouldn't mind finishing the bottle. She turned to look for the servant, but the man had already vanished into the shadows of the service corridor. The silence in the room was no longer polite, it was an indictment. The king looked from the empty glass to Silas's trembling form, his eyes narrowing with a cold, royal realization. "Remove the wine," the king commanded, his voice vibrating with a sudden, dangerous edge. "And bring the captain of the guard to my study. It seems the House of Valehart has brought more than just music to my court. They have brought the truth." Elinor felt the adrenaline crash over her like ice water. She sank back into her seat, her legs trembling beneath the sapphire silk. Frederick reached under the table, his hand finding hers. He squeezed her fingers, not as a duke to an heiress, but as a man to the woman who had just saved them both. "You have the wits of a fox, Elinor Valehart," he whispered, his eyes burning with an unshielded pride. "I have the wits of a piano player who spent too long watching the shadows," she corrected him, her voice finally beginning to steady. As the gala continued in a state of fractured elegance, Elinor looked across the table. Silas was gone, whisked away under the guise of illness, but Sir Alistair remained, his gaze a promise of a final, lethal confrontation. The assassination had failed, but the war had reached the palace walls. The poisoned vintage had been the first blow, and as Elinor looked at the silver ring on her finger, she knew that the next time Silas struck, it wouldn't be with wine. It would be with steel. "We leave tonight," Frederick murmured, leaning close. "The king's protection is a fickle thing. We go to the Valehart estate. It is time we stopped defending and started reclaiming." Elinor nodded, her gaze fixed on the empty place where her uncle had Saturday. The missing heiress had survived the night, and as she rose from the table, she realized she was no longer afraid of the dark. She was the dark. The chamber of the House of Lords was a cathedral of shadows and ancient lore, where the weight of centuries-old tradition pressed down upon Elinor Valehart like the cold stone of a tomb. Dressed in the unmistakable blue of her house, she walked toward the center of the chamber, the rhythmic click of her heels echoing against the vaulted ceiling. Beside her, Duke Frederick Halloway moved with a lethal, quiet confidence, his presence a warning to the assembly of peers who watched them with a mixture of skepticism and predatory curiosity. At the far end of the hall, Lord Silas stood behind a mahogany podium, his face a pale mask of desperation as he prepared to deliver his final strike against the niece he had tried to murder a decade ago. "This is a farce." Silas's voice cracked, echoing off the high stone arches. "The Duke has plucked a common musician from the gutters and draped her in silk to steal a title that belongs to me. This girl is an actress, a fraud who has spent her life in the shadows while I have maintained the Valehart legacy." Elinor did not flinch. She felt the old Nora Bell stirring, the girl who had survived by being invisible, but she suppressed her and stood tall as the missing heiress. She looked up at the High Chancellor, her eyes the color of a winter sea, reflecting a fire that Silas had failed to extinguish. "My uncle is correct about one thing," she said, her voice clear and resonant. "I have spent my life in the shadows. But I was not hiding from poverty, I was hiding from him." She gestured toward the center of the floor, where a small, ornate harpsichord had been placed, a relic brought from the Valehart estate under the king's guard. "My father, Julian Valehart, knew that names could be forged and faces could be forgotten," Elinor continued, her fingers grazing the silver ring on her left hand. "But he believed that blood and music were the only truths that could not be stolen." The lords leaned forward in a hushed silence as Elinor took her seat at the instrument. Frederick stood behind her, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder in a silent vow of protection. As she began to play, the music was not the mechanical, background soundtrack of a hired pianist, it was the Valehart Requiem, a piece composed by her mother that contained a series of jarring, complex dissonances. The melody felt like a haunting conversation with the dead. As Elinor reached the crescendo, she took the tarnished silver ring from her finger and pressed the crest into a hidden, recessed groove on the side of the instrument. The assembly gasped as a mechanical click resonated through the chamber. A secret compartment beneath the keyboard sprang open, revealing a scroll of parchment sealed with her father's private wax signet. "The true will," Frederick declared, his voice booming with the authority of a duke. Signed by Julian Valehart on the night of the fire, naming Elinor as his sole heir and detailing the treacherous debts Silas had accrued, debts he tried to erase with arson and blood. Silas's face went from pale to a ghastly, mottled purple. He lunged forward, but the captain of the guard was faster, pinning the old man's arms behind his back. The business arrangement that had brought Frederick and Elinor together had finally reached its ultimate goal, redemptive justice. Elinor Valehart, the High Chancellor announced, the sound of the name finally restoring her birthright. "The House of Lords recognizes you as the rightful mistress of your estate." As Silas was dragged from the chamber in disgrace, Elinor looked at Frederick. The fear that had defined her life was gone, replaced by the deep, protective love she had found in the man who had recognized her in the dark. She was no longer a ghost or a servant, she was a powerful duchess who had reclaimed her destiny. The limestone walls of the Valehart estate no longer smelled of damp ash and ancient grief. Under a soft spring sun, the ancestral home had been meticulously restored, its jagged wounds healed by stone and mortar, its hollow halls once again vibrant with the rhythm of life. Elinor stood in the center of the grand gallery, the morning light catching the intricate silver thread of her ivory lace gown. She looked down at her hands, the hands that had once been calloused by poverty and hidden in the shadows of velvet curtains. They were still the hands of a pianist, but the silver ring on her finger no longer felt like a secret bruise. It felt like a seal of authority. Outside, the air hummed with the arrival of London's elite. It was a stark contrast to the night at Halloway House when she had been the help. Today, the very aristocrats who had whispered scandals behind their fans were arriving as her guests, their carriages lining the drive of the woman they now called the most formidable duchess in the kingdom. Elinor watched them from the window, her expression one of calm, centered power. She was no longer Nora Bell, the invisible soul of the party. She was the hostess, the mistress of her own destiny, and the architect of her own peace. The door to the gallery opened, and the heavy, measured tread of Frederick's boots echoed against the polished floor. He stopped in the doorway, his dark green coat exchanged for the formal black of a bridegroom, his gaze finding her with an intensity that had never wavered. He didn't look at the restored frescoes or the gleaming silver, he looked only at her, his eyes reflecting a deep, protective pride. "The king's representative has arrived," Frederick said, his voice a low, resonant velvet. "And the ton is currently debating whether the Valehart blue or the Halloway emerald is the more fashionable color for the season. You have them all precisely where you want them, Elinor." Elinor turned from the window, her silk skirts whispering against the marble. "I don't want them anywhere, Frederick. I only want them to see that the girl they ignored is the woman they can no longer overlook. I am not playing for their approval today. I am playing for us." She walked to the grand piano that sat in the heart of the room, a magnificent instrument of ebony and gold, positioned not in a dark alcove, but in the path of the sun. She sat on the bench and struck a single, resonant chord. The music was bold, clear, and filled with the strength of a survivor. For 10 years, she had used her talent to disappear. Now, she used it to command the silence. Frederick walked over to the instrument, leaning his hand against the wood, his presence a grounding tether in the swirling excitement of the day. "The contract is long since finished," he murmured. "The oath is fulfilled. You owe the House of Halloway nothing, and yet you chose to stand by my side." "I chose to stand by the man who saw me when I was invisible," Elinor corrected him, her fingers dancing into a melody that was no longer a requiem, but a song of rebirth. The Duke found the heiress, but Frederick found Elinor. That is the only restoration that truly matters. As the ceremony began in the gardens, the transition was complete. Elinor walked down the aisle not as a project to be fixed or a debt to be paid, but as a sovereign in her own right. She greeted the peers and the ministers with a poise that made the rumors of the gutter girl seem like a fever dream. She moved through the social minefield with the same precision she used on the keys, turning potential slights into opportunities for grace. Years passed, and the legacy of the Duke and Duchess of Valehart became the new gold standard of the peerage. They were a partnership of equals, their home a sanctuary for those the world had cast aside. Elinor never forgot the sound of the piano in the dark, and she often spent her evenings playing for the children who filled the halls of the estate. She was no longer just the piano player. She was the woman who had walked through fire to find her voice, and she made sure that in her house, no one was ever truly invisible again. As she stood on the balcony of the Valehart estate on a quiet summer evening, Frederick's arm around her waist and the silver ring catching the light of the moon, Elinor finally closed the book on the ghosts of her past. The fire had taken much, but it had left behind the steel. The music she played now was no longer a shield, it was a celebration.